soothe your headaches and make
Sydney
your
Festival.
Sydney Festival opening! Woo!
change. Folks don't stay the same. Fly by night and crawl by day. I could try holy, holy, holy God.
I'm very excited. I've flown all the way from Dublin, Ireland to be here to see this duck spectacular.
Holy, holy God.
We're in the Domain and we're here for some funk and soul.
Hanging out for the Buddhist band.
They're all the same in different ways, like poultry games.
I'm excited to see Sharon Jones and the Duckies.
And I'm excited to see Charles Bradley.
Screaming eagle of soul.
The chain, the battery thinking chain of thoughts and games. Who could
Humphrey runs a marathon, and we're his hype girls, and we get him across the line.
holy God, holy, holy,
I love the dog.
holy, holy, holy God, holy, holy, holy God.
The dog now.
And look into your eyes and say, I mean it.